Hi there, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK. Thanks for watching. There's been a lot of talk about due process and whether undocumented migrants are entitled to it, so I'm going through the Supreme Court decisions on it. Today I want to talk about Wing versus the United States, the second case in a six-part series. Wing v. United States, 1896, was a pivotal U.S. Supreme Court case that affirmed due process protections for undocumented immigrants under the Fifth Amendment, particularly in criminal proceedings. The late 19th century was marked by intense anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly against Chinese immigrants, who faced widespread discrimination due to economic competition and racial prejudice. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and its 1888 amendment, the Scott Act, barred Chinese laborers from entering the U.S. and denied re-entry to those who left, even with prior residency. The Geary Act of 1892 extended these restrictions, requiring Chinese residents to carry residency certificates and imposing harsh penalties for non-compliance. Section 4 of the Act allowed for the imprisonment at hard labor of any Chinese person found unlawfully in the U.S., without requiring a judicial trial, only an administrative hearing before a U.S. commissioner. This period saw frequent deportations and detentions of Chinese immigrants, often with minimal legal recourse, reflecting a broader trend of treating non-citizens as outside constitutional protections. Federal and local authorities aggressively enforced immigration laws targeting Chinese communities in cities like Detroit, where Wing was arrested. The lack of judicial oversight in these proceedings raised concerns about arbitrary punishment and due process violations. Wing, a Chinese immigrant arrested in Detroit, Michigan, for being unlawfully in the U.S. under the Geary Act. United States, represented by federal authorities enforcing the Geary Act, which mandated imprisonment and deportation for undocumented Chinese immigrants. In 1892, Wing and three other Chinese immigrants were arrested and charged with being unlawfully in the U.S. A U.S. commissioner determined their undocumented status after a summary hearing without a jury trial. Under Section 4 of the Geary Act, they were sentenced to 60 days of imprisonment at hard labor in a Detroit house of correction, followed by deportation to China. Wing challenged his sentence, arguing that subjecting him to criminal punishment without a judicial trial violated his Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights to due process and a jury trial. He filed a habeas corpus petition, which reached the Supreme Court after lower courts upheld his detention. Did the Geary Act's provision for imprisonment at hard labor without a judicial trial violate the Fifth Amendment's due process clause for undocumented immigrants? Did the lack of a jury trial for such punishment infringe on Sixth Amendment protections, which apply to criminal prosecutions? Ruling: the Supreme Court ruled that the Geary Act's provision for imprisonment at hard labor without a judicial trial was unconstitutional, violating the Fifth Amendment's due process clause. Due process: the court held that undocumented immigrants, as persons within U.S. jurisdiction, are entitled to due process protections when facing criminal punishment. Imprisonment at hard labor constituted a criminal penalty, not merely an administrative immigration measure, and thus required a judicial proceeding with constitutional safeguards. Sixth Amendment: the court also found that such punishment without a jury trial violated the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees a trial by jury in criminal prosecutions. The administrative process under the Geary Act was insufficient for imposing punitive measures. Immigration authority upheld. The court affirmed Congress's plenary power to regulate immigration, including the authority to deport undocumented immigrants through administrative processes. Thus, the deportation aspect of the Geary Act was upheld, as deportation was considered a civil, not criminal, proceeding. Key quote: "No limits can be put by the courts upon the power of Congress to protect the country from the entry of aliens, but when the law imposes infamous punishment All the constitutional safeguards for the protection of the citizen apply to aliens as well. Outcome: the court invalidated Wong Wing's sentence of imprisonment at hard labor, ordering his release from that punishment. However, his deportation could proceed under the Geary Act's administrative framework. Legal significance: due process for non-citizens. Wong Wing v. United States established that undocumented immigrants have Fifth Amendment due process protections when facing criminal punishments, such as imprisonment. This extended the principle from Yikwo v. Hopkins, 1886, that constitutional rights apply to all persons within U.S. jurisdiction, regardless of citizenship or immigration status. Distinction between civil and criminal proceedings. The ruling distinguished between civil immigration actions, like deportation, which can be handled administratively, and criminal punishments, like imprisonment, which require full constitutional protections. This distinction remains foundational in immigration law, influencing cases like Zadvydas v. Davis, 2001. Sixth Amendment protections. By invoking the Sixth Amendment, the court underscored that undocumented immigrants are entitled to jury trials for criminal prosecutions, reinforcing the broader applicability of constitutional safeguards in punitive contexts. The decision struck down the Geary Act's provision for imprisonment at hard labor without trial, protecting undocumented immigrants from arbitrary criminal punishment. It forced authorities to revise enforcement practices, ensuring judicial proceedings for punitive measures. However, the ruling did not halt deportations or broader anti-Chinese policies. The Geary Act's administrative deportation framework remained intact, and Chinese immigrants continued to face ongoing exclusion and harassment. Wong Wing set a precedent for protecting non-citizens from criminal penalties without due process, influencing later cases like Yamataya v. Fisher, 1903, which extended due process to deportation hearings, and Demore v. Kim, 2003, which addressed detention rights. It remains a key authority in immigration law, cited in challenges to punitive immigration policies, such as indefinite detention or harsh penalties without judicial review. The case's distinction between civil and criminal proceedings shapes modern immigration enforcement, where deportation is treated as a civil matter, but detention or fines may trigger constitutional scrutiny. In 2025, Wong Wing is referenced in debates over immigration detention and deportation practices, particularly when policies appear punitive. Advocates cite it to challenge prolonged detentions without hearings and highlight its role in affirming non-citizen rights. Some argue its protections are limited in contexts like expedited removal, where due process is curtailed. Limitations and critiques. The ruling only addressed criminal punishments, leaving administrative deportation and detention largely untouched. This allowed continued harsh immigration enforcement without full judicial oversight, limiting the case's overall impact on immigration policies. Historical context. While a victory for due process, the case did not dismantle the Chinese Exclusion Act or systemic anti-Chinese policies, which persisted for decades, continuing discrimination against Chinese immigrants and impacting future laws. Modern challenges. The civil-criminal distinction can weaken protections in immigration contexts, as many modern enforcement actions, such as detention, are classified as civil, limiting due process rights compared to criminal proceedings.
Wong Wing v. United States, 1896, arose from the discriminatory enforcement of the Geary Act, which imposed imprisonment at hard labor on undocumented Chinese immigrants without judicial trials. The Supreme Court's unanimous ruling invalidated this provision, affirming that undocumented immigrants are entitled to Fifth and Sixth Amendment protections against criminal punishments. The case distinguished between civil immigration actions and criminal penalties, reinforcing due process for non-citizens while upholding Congress's immigration authority. Its legacy endures in immigration law, protecting against punitive measures without fair proceedings. Its pertinence to the present issues, such as Kilmar Abrego Garcia, is that sending migrants to overseas prisons without a trial is no different than sending them to domestic prisons without a trial. The Supreme Court has ruled that you can't imprison people without due process. Full stop.
Once again, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch the next chapter, remember to click like and subscribe, and bookmark the Supreme Court playlist to keep up with all the videos in this series.